All right, so let's get going on today's class. So before we begin our wrap-up of language and then are looking at a new idea, which is decision-making and judgment, we have our next step in the social media professional development, and this is going to be assignment number 7. So what we're going to do for this one is we're going to continue that idea of giving before you take. We're going to continue that idea of helping out other people. And right now we have a rather exciting event that is coming up that is going to be our gift to others to help promote it. And specifically, it is the 2019 Undergraduate Research Conference that is going to be happening here at IUSB. So for those of you that might not have heard about this, Indiana University South Bend, every year we have an undergraduate research conference, and this is where we gather research that has been done by students like yourselves, and they get to present it in a conference setting, present it to a public audience, and that is happening this Friday, April 12th. So one of the things that we're going to do to help out other students is we're going to try to build them an audience. We're going to try to get the word out about their presentation. So this is an example of a presentation that happened. This was 2 years ago at the 2017 IUSB URC. And this is Lauren Leonard, and she did this great presentation on her research where she was looking at preventing autistic stereotypies in a classroom setting. So how could that be done? What sort of techniques would help autistic children in that classroom setting? So a lot of important research is being done, and we're going to contribute to the psychology community by promoting some of that research. So what I would like you to do is I would like you to promote, get the word out on 5 presentations. What I'm going to do is we're in the midst of finalizing the URC program. So I will get you that final copy. I'll upload it to Canvas so you can have the entire array of presentations to choose from. But I do know about a number of psychology presentations, which will probably be of particular interest to your network. So I'm asking everyone here to promote those, promote 5 of these presentations over the next week. And just to give you an idea of what is required for this particular assignment, the required information that I'm asking for, author of the presentation, so let them know who's doing the presentation. Many of them have Twitter accounts, so if you can use that @ and then their name, their Twitter account, you can find it, do that as well. So author of the presentation, title of the presentation, hashtag it the IUSB URC 2019, and then conference is separate. The date, Friday, April 12th. Time and location of the presentation. Mention that it's open to the public, so this is a public event. You can attend it if you're an IUSB student. You can attend it if you're a high school student. You can attend it if you're a member of the public. And then we're going to hashtag it with support undergrad research. And we're also going to hashtag it with IUSB 2019, and hopefully IUSB's Twitter account will pick up some of these and retweet them as well. So just give you an idea of what this would look like. This is one of the presentations, and you can go into Canvas, download this PowerPoint, and basically just use this as a template. Kind of make it your own, but use it as a template to send these out. So for example, Landry Jones will be presenting popularity and abuse of female comic book characters at IUSB URC 2019 conference, Friday, April 12th at 9 a.m. in EA 1021. Presentation is open to the public, hashtag support undergrad research, hashtag IUSB 2019. So that's an example of one of the presentations that's going to be happening at the URC 2019. Cassandra Reyes is going to be presenting on canine training methods, so how to train seeing eye dogs. Once again, hashtag it with the hashtag for the 2019 URC. This one again, April 12th at 9 a.m. in EA 1021. Presentation is open to the public. Support undergrad research, IUSB 2019. So those are 2 of the presentations. Here's a third. Callista Lucenheiser will be presenting effects of motor mimicry on victim blaming. So what's an aspect of whether or not when you hear a story, will you blame the victim or any part of what occurred in that particular incident. As it turns out, motor mimicry, whether you reenact the actions, just the physical actions that the person has when they're telling the story, might have an effect on whether you empathize with them or not. So that's Callista Lucenheiser. We got David Pugh, which is doing complex choices and why you won't like them. This is a very interesting one where he took a look at video games that have multiple branching storylines and took a look at the ratings of those video games to see if the complexity actually increased or decreased the ratings in this particular art form. We have Hannah Quinn, who's going to be doing the effect of mood on cognitive functions. So this is actually a shortened version of the title, but if you need to stay within that, I think it's 280 character limit, feel free. So that's coming up on how different moods can specifically affect different hemispheres of your brain and different cognitive functions. Alexis Hall will be presenting lack of physical communication and connection to male suicide. So is there an effect or an influence on male suicide? The fact that our culture sort of frowns upon, or there's a stigma attached to male physical contact as opposed to female physical contact. So the fact that males are not getting hugs, does that influence at all their depression and their rates of suicide? Alyssa Eubanks, how social media impacts women's self-esteem and intervention methods for those. So there are a lot of interesting talks being done. Maura Hoban, cell phone use around the world, is it contributing to cognitive decline? So is it the case that the fact that we use cell phones now, as many, I don't want to say older people, but as many elderly people who grew up without cell phones have this bias against using cell phones and have this idea that, oh, attention spans are decreasing, your ability to think is decreasing, instant gratification, you know, we expect everything immediately. Well, does cell phone use actually contribute to cognitive decline, or is cell phone use actually helping cognitive abilities? Are we actually getting better because of cell phone use? Maura Hoban is going to be talking about that. And then just a bunch of interesting, really interesting talks. Mark McElliott, our political news articles stressing this out. So there's a constant barrage of news articles about what is going on in politics, what is going on in the world. Is that contributing to our stress? Or maybe is that not actually the case? That's not affecting our stress levels. Renee Pintal is going to be talking about the development of political attitudes. Where do our attitudes ever come from? Have you ever wondered why somebody will grow up and say, I'm a Democrat, while somebody else will grow up and say, I'm a Republican? She's looking at that. Sandra Ridge, political affiliation and word usage, a very interesting study to see if the articles and the words that people on the right use, are they different than people on the left? Will they use more future tense than past tense? Will they use more nouns and adjectives? And is that because of the way that they think? Benjamin Ike, the effect of attire on perception. So how do the clothes that you wear affect whether people are going to like you in a certain social setting? And does that interact with race? Are the rules different for different races? Taylor Yoder, this is the last one I'll mention. Taylor Yoder, very interesting talk on conformity in church beliefs, attitudes towards gay and lesbian people. So how does the level of conformity of an individual interact with what their church is preaching about gay and lesbian people? How does that affect their attitudes? So that's just a sampling of some of the talks that are going to be there. So I'll upload the entire program. And again, we're just asking you to take five of those presentations and promote one over the course of the next week, just in a tweet. And again, make sure that you got that required information. You want the name, you want the title, hashtag IUSB URC 2019 conference, the date, the time, and the place. There's 3 separate sessions, so make sure that you have that correct. Let the people know that they can come. Presentations open to the public. Support undergraduate research and hashtag IUSB 2019. All right, so 5 presentations, 5 tweets, and the due date for that is going to be Thursday, April 11th. So we have right up until the day before the URC at 11:59 p.m. to kind of help get the word out so that the people presenting can have maximum impact and reach as wide an audience as possible. So that's the social media development assignment. Next one. And then also, just so that you know, I will be working out a system for bonus points for this particular class if you actually attend the URC panels. So if you are interested in earning some extra bonus points towards your final grade in this class, completely optional, but hence the bonus. But if you are, just save the date. The URC takes place April 12th, that's a Friday, and there's panels starting at 9 a.m. and then the final set of panels ends at 2:30. So if you're interested in going to see some really interesting research done by your peers and earning yourself some points in the process, just save that date. All right. So now let us go back to language and finish up our look at language before we start our look at judgments and decision-making and problem-solving. So last time we took a look at what language actually is, so some of the characteristics that human language in particular has. We took a look at psycholinguistics, the area of research on language, kind of the psychology of language, and took a look at some of the levels at which they analyze language. We started off with, or we focused in on language comprehension. We covered perceiving words and phonemes, so we saw that categorical perception, those categorical boundaries, where everything on one side of that boundary, even though the physical stimulus is different, it all sounds the same to us. Everything on the other side of the boundary, even though the physical stimuli can differ, all sounds the same to us, and that contributes to your ability to produce and learn a second language, because different languages have their categorical boundaries set up in different locations. So that's where we ended up. Today we're going to take a look at how do we understand words, and we're basically going to move up the complexity of language. So we started off with the basic unit of language, the basic unit of sound, phonemes, which is the smallest sound that carries any meaning. Now we're going to take a look at words, and then we're going to take a look at understanding sentences, understanding texts, and understanding stories. And then we'll introduce and start up on our next chapter, which is problem solving. All right, so language comprehension. So understanding words. Understanding words, we're just going to scratch the surface on a lot of these psycholinguistic issues. But one of the big challenges in understanding words, if you can identify the word, so we're beyond decoding the sounds, we are now in the stage where you hear the sound correctly. How do you know what the word stands for? And one of the big issues with that is the idea of lexical ambiguity. And one of the big challenges in our language comprehension is the fact that the same exact word can have more than one meaning. So it is a cognitive process to determine which of those meanings is the actual intended meaning for any particular words. So lexical ambiguity, studies have shown that it's often resolved by context. The meaning of the word is often resolved by the context in which the word is used. So a nice illustration of that, we're going to take a look at two videos. One video is going to have the same words as the second video, but in one video it's going to be in one context, and then the second video is going to be in a second context, and we're going to see how different contexts can give the same word different meanings. All right, so we're going to go in the Wayback Playback machine right now, and we're going to visit the 80s. Definitely one of the most stalkeriest videos I think you're ever going to see. So if you're not familiar with Lionel Richie's Hello, just going to give you a little bit of a taste of it today. But just to kind of set up the situation. In this video, I'm hoping they're in university. They might be in high school, but I'm hoping they're in university. Anyways, Lionel Richie is a teacher. He's a theater professor. And this is the touching love story between Lionel Richie and a blind student of his that he has a particular affection for. So prepare to cringe. It has not aged well. That's how poorly it's aged. They're like, no, we can't actually allow you to watch this. All right, one moment.
Billy Boy has been in prison for 25 years.
All right, we don't got to hear about Billy Boy. You got the background story, so let's go to, I think right about there.
That's gone too. You're a regular Rip Van Winkle, aren't you?
All right, so that's a visit to HR. That's borderline. All right, so you can watch the rest on your own time. Just so you know, that was romantic in the 80s. So times have definitely changed. All right, so, but you will notice that there was a lot of words being used in that song, a lot of language, a lot of sayings. You know, I can see it in your eyes. You know, I can see it in your smile. So now let's take a look at a different version of that exact same song. Let's see if I can get this one working. Let's see if we can get a different version of that exact same song, but that uses much different context in its portrayal. And once again, we'll give it a try. Here we go.
I've been alone with you inside my mind. In my dream, I kissed your lips 1,000 times.
I sometimes
See you pass outside my door.
Hello.
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 Hello. To me. I can see it in your eyes. I can see it in your smile. You're all like weather. What?
And like, oh.
Oh, nothing like. Because you know just what to say. And you know just what to do. I'm going to tell you so much.
I love you.
All right, so exact same words, but very different underlying context between the two. So you can imagine, this is a dramatic instance here, but you can imagine the difficulty in actually comprehending a language, because you're gonna run into lexical ambiguity all the time, and what it means in one context is going to differ between what it means in a separate context. So if you ask just a very simple question, such as, what does smile mean? When you hear the word smile, what does it mean? So in this case, in the Lionel Richie Hello video, the line, I can see it in your smile, smile in that case came from a context where it refers to the actual noun, right? The actual thing, the smile, the parting of your lips, the showing of your teeth, upward curve of the mouth. In the amalgamated montage version, smile actually came from a Planet of the Apes film where it was the verb. So it was a photographer actually indicating that they want the person to smile, right? So exact same word, two different contexts. One of them is a noun, one of them is a verb. And we as human beings have to decode that because many words that we have have that lexical ambiguity. So the line about arms, hold you in my arms. Arms in the one case actually meant the physical arms. Arms in this one was a military man calling his army, his soldiers, to arms, right? Like grab your guns, grab your weapons, to arms here. So again, the same word can have wildly different meanings depending upon the context that it comes from. So when you take that up an even greater step, you can imagine how difficult it is, not just understanding words, but what about when you get even more complicated? When you start stringing words together and you're trying to understand sentences, texts, and stories. So in sentences, texts, and stories, you need to understand how these words that can have lexical ambiguity are then strung together to create some sort of meaning in a sentence. And again, that meaning can change depending upon the structure, the order, the placement of the words. So, John kicked Billy is very, very different than Billy kicked John, right? The meaning is completely different, even though you have the exact same words. So we need to make inferences. Oftentimes when we're understanding a sentence, it makes it even more complex because we sometimes have to make inferences that go beyond the actual information that is presented in the sentence. So not only do we have to decode the information that's in the sentence, but we actually have to bring in a whole slew of knowledge from outside sources. We have to access our semantic networks of knowledge and bring in that information in order to make sense of the sentence. And nowhere, I think, in human language is this more evident than in comedy. So comedy is a lot of jokes in comedy, and this is going to be the least funniest presentation on comedy ever. But if you break down comedy, if you explain the joke, which you're never supposed to do, you'll notice that a lot of comedy is giving you words that head in one direction, and then the punchline kind of flips that and gives you a second interpretation. So it makes you think that a person's going one way, and then it flips that information. It basically traps your inferences into one interpretation, and then flips the switch and makes you involve another interpretation. So one example of this, one comedian that used to do this all the time, one of my favorites, Mitch Hedberg. If you've never seen him, highly recommend Google him on YouTube. Unfortunately, no longer with us, but what a great wealth of material he gave us. And he would, again, use these things about inferences to help you understand a sentence. So one bit he goes, they call corn on the cob, right? But that's how it comes out of the ground, man. They should call that corn, and they should call every other version corn off the cob. It's not like if you cut off my arm, you would call my arm Mitch, but then reattach it and call it Mitch altogether. So to understand this joke, it takes a lot of understanding. You got to know what corn on the cob is. You got to know what corn is, right? That's not there in the sentence. It doesn't explain it in the sentence. You got to make the analogy that if he was treated like corn and you actually remove the part of him, you wouldn't call that Mitch and then sew it back on and call him Mitch altogether. So again, it has that idea of taking knowledge that you have that's outside of the sentence and using that against you to kind of, trick you into that comedic experience. So I haven't slept for 10 days. If somebody told you that, I haven't slept for 10 days, you would use your knowledge and say, all right, this person, oh my gosh, you haven't slept for 10 days. You have been awake for 10 days. That is the information that I bring to this sentence. That's my interpretation of the sentence. So he goes, I haven't slept for 10 days because that would be too long. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, you do not sleep 240 hours straight, right? So it kind of flips that interpretation. This part is interpreted in one way, but then when this part comes along, you got to flip that to the other side. One time this guy handed me a picture of him. He said, here's a picture of me when I was younger. Every picture is a picture of you when you were younger, right? So you never even think about this, right? Somebody hands a picture of you, says, hey, here's a picture of me when I'm younger. You understand how pictures work. So when this part comes, you're like, oh my gosh, every single picture of you is a picture of you when you were younger. Here's a picture of me when I'm older. You son of a bitch, how'd you pull that off? When I was a boy, I laid in my twin-size bed, right? Once again, you got to bring in your information. What is a twin-size bed? Why do they call it a twin size bed, right? So when you have a bed, twin size bed, we know what that means. And wondered where my brother was, right? So now you got to bring in what a twin is, right? Not a twin size bed, but what is actually a twin? So if he had a twin, he has a brother. If he's lying there alone, where's his brother? I order the club sandwich all the time, but I'm not even a member, man. I don't know how I get away with it. So again, club. What does club mean? Club sandwich means one thing. Being a part of a club means another. How to start anyway? I like my sandwiches with 3 pieces of bread. So do I. Well, let's form a club then. All right, but we need more stipulations. Yes, we do. Instead of cutting the sandwich once, let's cut it again. Yes, 4 triangles, and we will position them into a circle. In the middle, we will dump chips or potato salad. Okay, I got a question for you. How do you feel about Philly toothpicks? I'm for them. Well, then this club is formed. Spread the word on menus nationwide. I like my sandwiches with alfalfa sprouts. Well, you're not in the effing club. So this all, again, brings into that idea that a club sandwich is not a club. It's not an organization. And yet at the same time, they have a meeting as if it's an organization. None of this makes sense unless you know what a committee is, unless you know how clubs are formed, unless you know that at the beginning they will have those stipulations. All of that is information that needs to be brought in. Otherwise, you would look at this and say, all right, I guess that's how club sandwiches were made. I don't find anything ludicrous or comedic about this at all. All right, so let's wrap up our look by taking a look at some a particular instance of ambiguity, a particular instance of using context and using your knowledge in order to solve an ambiguity. And 2 types of ambiguity have been identified. And ambiguity in a sentence is when a sentence can be interpreted in 2 ways, right? So a sentence can be interpreted in 1 or 2 ways depending upon the structure and depending upon the words that are used. So an example of that is something like this. John went to the bank. So if I told you John went to the bank, this can be interpreted in 2 distinct ways because bank is actually ambiguous, right? It's got that lexical ambiguity. So this might refer to the fact that John went to the financial institution, the bank, right? John went out of state to go find a Bank of America. So in this case, John went to this financial institution. But it can also be interpreted in that John went to a body of land that is the side of water, right? So maybe he went to the riverbank. Both of those are consistent with this sentence over here. Both of those are a valid interpretation of John went to the bank. So this is what is known as permanent ambiguity, because by the time you end the sentence, in the sentence alone, there is no way to resolve the ambiguity. In this sentence alone, there is no way that you can figure out what bank is supposed to mean. You need to go outside of the sentence, right? So if you know John needed money, you can bring in that outside information and say, all right, this is probably where John went. If you've been camping, if you were in a campsite and you ask, where's John? And they say, oh, John went to the bank. You would use that outside information of where you were to come to this interpretation. But in the sentence alone, you cannot resolve the ambiguity. That is permanent ambiguity. So the ambiguity remains at the end of the sentence. There's no way to resolve it. That's an example of permanent ambiguity. You can also have temporary ambiguity. You can have ambiguity where a sentence starts out ambiguous, but then by the end of the sentence, you can make the determination of the correct interpretation. So this ambiguity is resolved at the end of the sentence. So an example of that would be the sentence that begins with the old train. So if you begin a sentence with the old train, we have lexical ambiguity here. Actually, we got 2 sources of lexical ambiguity. So on the one case, train could be a noun, referring to a locomotive. Old could be an adjective, referring to the age of the train. So this could be the old train, referring to that situation right there. Or it could refer to this coach over here. Now, old is a noun, the old, the elderly. Train is a verb. They train, they teach, they coach. So we don't know which one it is. It could be this situation, it could be this situation. Right now we got ambiguity, but this is temporal ambiguity because by the end of the sentence, it's resolved. So when we end the sentence by saying the old trained the young, we know that it can't be that sentence up there because that does not make any grammatical sense. It doesn't fit the structure. The only interpretation is this one down here. So once you go the old trained the young, you know that this is the interpretation that is intended, that lexical ambiguity, that sentence ambiguity has been resolved, hence temporary ambiguity. All right, and the last thing we're going to take a look at here are what are known as garden path sentences. So this is all to sort of develop an appreciation of just how difficult language studies are, just how difficult understanding language is. And as is a sort of theme in psychology and cognitive psychology, many of the things that we do that we find very difficult are actually very easy to explain, very easy to understand, and hence very easy to implement into a, for example, computer program. Many of the things that we do that are extremely simple and easy for us are actually very difficult to understand, very difficult to explain, very difficult to implement into a computer program. So one example of that, the classic example, is math. A lot of math is very difficult for us. We find it very hard to divide triple-digit numbers or multiply triple-digit numbers. But calculators and adding machines were one of the first computers that were ever made because it was a very straightforward way to understand how to do it. On the other hand, we understand language very easily, right? It's something a little child can do very, very well. But computers that understand language have been a long time in development. Because of connectionism, we're actually kind of finally getting there. But this is one of those instances where studies were done on specifically garden path sentences to illustrate just how difficult it is, to kind of push us to our limit of processing to see how it is that we make decisions about what should be the interpretation of a sentence. So these are all sentences that have temporal ambiguity. They're called garden path sentences because the sentence itself leads you along the garden path. It leads you the wrong way. So these are sentences where the design of it is first makes you have one interpretation. They tend to be very strongly biased towards that one interpretation. But then when you reach the end of the sentence, you have to make another interpretation. And oftentimes it's confusing, and it allows us as a psychologist to view the processing of that information kind of in real time. So the I haven't slept for 10 days because that would be too long. That's an example of a garden path sentence where you start off with one interpretation, but then when you get to the end of the sentence, you realize, oh, I've gone down the wrong path. I got to go back and reinterpret an entire sentence. So another example of that would be the following. So we'll build it up word by word. So the complex houses. So as you start decoding the sentence and you reach the complex houses, probably the interpretation that you're going to come up with is that this sentence here is going to be about some very complicated houses. This sentence here is going to be about some houses that really are rather intricate, rather heavily designed, and not just one house, right? It's the complex houses. So we go to this idea, we're starting to interpret it, and we have this idea of a series of complex houses, a bunch of complex houses. So the complex house is married, and then all of a sudden we're confused. All of a sudden we're wondering, what is the interpretation? What am I supposed to do with this? Is this some fantasy world where houses actually marry each other and there's some sort of ceremony, some house ceremony or something? What is the interpretation here? You start to get confused. The complex house is married and single. So even that doesn't help resolve it. The complex house is married and single soldiers. That all of a sudden starts to make more sentence. And then you add the complex houses, married and single soldiers and their family. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I get it. We're not talking about complex houses. We're talking about a complex that houses married and single soldiers and their families. So it led you down the wrong way. Once you read the complex houses, you were thinking of those complicated living quarters. But the complex here is actually like a living complex. It's actually like a series of a place where you would live. So this is resolved, but definitely, I mean, I can see the looks on everybody's faces. You went down the wrong way at the beginning. And then once you got to the end here, it took you a little bit of time to decide, oh, okay, I get where we're going here. And then you have to redo like the entire sentence. So these sentences are oftentimes used in experiments, used in research, because they give insight into that rather complicated process of parsing, that rather complicated process of breaking up a sentence into the meaningful bits, deciding how that's done, and seeing the actual kind of reaction times and mechanisms at work by giving us very complicated sentences that lead us the wrong way and lead us down that garden path. All right, so that was our brief kind of overview of psychology and language. Any questions on anything that we saw today before we go on to the decision making? No. Problem solving? All right, so off we go, problem solving. So what we're going to do now is we're going to end this semester by basically taking a look at some of the highest level cognitive phenomenon that we have. So we've started out in this semester very simple. We started out with like attention, right? Just where are you looking? What information are you processing? And as we've gone through, it's gotten more and more high-end, more and more complicated, complex. And now we're talking about some of the highest level things that we can do. So we just finished with language. Now we're going to take a look at problem solving. So how is it that we solve a problem? We're going to start much like we did with everything else. What is a problem? What are we studying when we study problem solving? We're going to take a look at some problems known as Wordies. And then we're going to take a look at different theories about how we go about problem solving. So we'll talk about restructuring. We'll talk about functional fixedness, which is a barrier to problem solving. We'll talk about mental sets, which also can be a barrier to problem solving. Incubation effects. And if we can reach there today, we'll end with insight problems. All right, so what is a problem? What are we studying when we're studying problem solving? So a problem requires two things to be in effect. It has two characteristics. Number one, there has to be an obstacle between your present state and your goal state. So you have a goal and you don't have it yet. It's a goal you want to obtain, and there's an obstacle between your attainment of the goal. So that's characteristic number one. And characteristic number two is that it's not immediately obvious how to get around that obstacle. So if I had my glass, my mug, on that table right there, and I was sitting here and I wanted a drink, we have a present state, right? I'm over here. We have a goal state. I want to get over there and pick up my mug. But that's not a problem because there's no obstacle in the way, and it is very immediately apparent how I'm going to do that. I'm just going to walk over and I'm going to pick it up. So problems require these two things. You got that obstacle, and it's not immediately obvious how you get around that obstacle. And problem solving, one of the kind of seminal research that was done on it very early was Kohler, when he did chimpanzee problem solving. And this is actually a really kind of fascinating look at how scientists oftentimes do their work, because he did not intend necessarily to do chimpanzee problem solving, but if my memory serves me correctly, he was just stuck on an island, and he had like 2 weeks to kill before he could get picked up and taken off that island. It wasn't like a desert island. He was on an island where, you know, the ferry wasn't going to come for a couple of weeks. And he just decided to do some problem-solving studies on the chimpanzees that were housed there. So let's take a look at some of these. And we'll see some of the problems that he set up for the chimpanzees. Oh, finally. All right, so this is actual footage that they have. So we got a banana that's being hung up here. We got boxes. So the present state of the chimpanzee, down on the ground. The goal state, get the banana. Obstacle, distance. Solution immediately apparent? No, it's not. The chimpanzee's gotta work it out. So this is an example of problem solving. So you can see the chimpanzee is trying to work at it. It's trying to do something that we'll see later, which is decrease the distance between your present state and your goal state. That's one of the strategies for its problem solving. And it's doing its best. Almost. I know. I was gonna pause it. There we go. All right. So he made it. Yeah. All right. I was like, I'm gonna pause it, but I didn't want to stop it. So there are other problems that we're not gonna take a look at that was on that video as well. You can check those out. But just to kind of give you a rundown of those. So Kohler would put a banana beyond a gate and would have sticks there that were too short to reach the banana. So once again, you got the monkey in the present state on one side of the wall. You got the banana on the other state. That's the goal state, out of reach, right? Obstacle between the two, the wall, not immediately apparent how it was gonna reach that. And the sticks were too short. So the monkey tried, or the chimpanzee tried to reach with the sticks, but it was too short. And the solution to the problem was that the two sticks would fit one inside each other so that you can elongate the stick. And eventually the chimpanzee was able to get the banana. We saw the one just now where you had to stack crates upon each other to attain the banana. Once again, present state, chimpanzee down here, goal state, get the banana, it's all the way up there. Distance is the obstacle. Solution, as you saw, not immediately apparent. And then this is another example where they have to combine the two, use the stick and the crate in order to achieve the desired goal, which is the banana. So this is your sort of classic examples of problems. And again, keep that in mind. That is what is required in a problem. So if you're doing research on processing or cognitive abilities, and they don't have these two characteristics, it's not actually problem solving. So these are the required characteristics for problem solving. Yep.
My parents made me work in a factory over the summer, and I worked next to a girl who was in jail for a long time, and she said that she really likes jail, likes being in jail.
Okay.
And I asked her why, and she said because when you're out of jail, you have to make thousands and thousands of decisions daily and figure things out, and in prison everything is lined up and handled for you. So she said she didn't have to think, and now she's out and it stresses her out.
Yeah. So that's an example of how now for her, she's got distances between her present state and her goal states, and she has solutions that are not immediately obvious. And part of that is the fact that her environment was so structured beforehand, and now it's not.
Yeah.
So for a lot of us, and we'll see this come up when we look at functional fixedness in mental sets, a lot of us have developed those strategies, and now it's no longer a problem for us because it is immediately obvious. But problems are difficult. Problems are
freak out with the
mentally exhausting.
And I'm like, no, it's fine. It's really easy. Just do this. And she's
like,
oh.
Yeah, exactly. So that's an example of how, due to the definition of problem solving, many of the things that she encountered as a problem, you would not encounter as a problem, because for you, it would be immediately obvious. Like you just said, no, you just do this, right? But for her, not immediately obvious. And that, again, is the definition, but is the difference between what's not a problem and what is a problem. It's those two factors. And incidentally, that is also not an uncommon experience. And one of the reasons why now that the stigma of living at home, I think, has been removed more and more and more, more and more individuals are staying at home because of problems that they're encountering. And if you just look up the hashtag adulting, you'll know exactly what those problems are. So for a lot of parents, doing the laundry is not a problem because it's immediately obvious how you do the laundry. For a lot of young adults who have, and this is where I'm completely on board with the young adults who have not been taught how to do this, it is an issue for them. It is a problem for them. So there is actually courses that are popping up where they teach young adults the life skills that you normally would have encountered in previous generations growing up. And I don't know why we're not doing that for our children these days, but there are things like how to sew a button. There are things like how to change a tire. And again, does anybody here know how to sew a button? Oh, that's nice. Does anybody here know how to change a tire? All right, fewer people. For anybody that knows how to sew a button or knows how to change a tire, did any of you learn it on your own? And by on your own, I mean somebody didn't instruct you and you didn't go to YouTube to figure it out. Exactly. All right. So all of those ones where I see people is like, oh, how do they not know how to do this? These individuals. And I was like, well, they haven't been shown how to do this. Somebody has to take them down and say, hey, look, this is how you do laundry. And that takes it from being a problem to being just something that you can do because it removes this not immediately obvious how to get around that obstacle criteria. All right, so let's take a look at some problems right now. So we're going to have this as a kind of in-class exercise. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up some wordies. And what I would like you to do is don't call out the answer. We're going to take them up at a later point in this lecture. So don't call out the answer, but try to figure it out. So write it down, and we'll see how many solutions you can get. So the first one is an example just to kind of show you how these wordies work. So they're a picture word puzzle that illustrates a common phrase or a word. So for example, here we have Daffy, Donald, and Mallard. And this is the phrase. Does anybody know what phrase this is?
Ducks in a row.
It's ducks in a line or ducks in a row. So Daffy is a duck, Daffy duck, Donald duck, Mallard is the name for a male duck, and we have all of them in a row. So there's multiples. We got ducks. They're all in a row. This is the phrase ducks in a row. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop up some wordies, and I'm going to give you, let's do this 30 seconds for each, and see if you can figure out what each of these wordies is. So it's a common phrase. Try to figure it out. You got 30 seconds for the first one. Here we go. So don't call it out. Just write down the phrase.
Oh.
All right, here's the next one. Common phrase. All right, next one. Yeah. This one is very challenging. All right, last one. All right, so keep your answers handy. I will give you the answers to those. We will take those up but they're going to be used in a later demonstration as well, so I can't tell the answers right now. Keep your, yeah, I know. Problem solving usually is. So keep your answers handy. We're going to get to those if we got time today, otherwise suspense for the weekend. Yeah. All right, so we took a look at what problems are. You've experienced 4 problems right there, right? You have a current state, where you are right now. You don't know what the wordie is. You have a goal state. You want to figure out the phrase. You have an obstacle. It's not spelled out for you, and it's not immediately obvious. You got to try to figure out what it is. So those are problems. And now we're going to take a look at how psychology identifies or thinks about how do we actually solve some of these problems. What are the factors or the phenomena that are involved when you actually solve a problem? And one idea about how we actually solve problems, how do we get from that goal state to that, from that current initial state to the goal state, is that you restructure your representation of the problem. And once you restructure your representation, that not immediately obvious solution becomes immediately obvious. So to solve a problem, you need to represent the problem. And some representations, in our mind, we represent these problems. Some representations make solving the problem massively easy. So some representations just make it very straightforward in terms of how you can solve the problem. In reality, removes it from being a problem because the solution becomes immediately obvious. But if you represent it the wrong way, it is not easy. If you represent it the wrong way, some problems are actually impossible to correctly solve if you represent them in the wrong way. So I'll give you another problem here. So what I would like you to do is this first challenge. So here we have parking spaces that are numbered. And what I would like you to try to figure out is what is the number of the parking space that the car is parked in. So try to figure that out. What is the number? When that car drives away, what's the number that you're going to see underneath that car? Well, this one I will answer today. Yeah. All right, has anybody figured out the answer? Hands up, don't yell it out, just hands up. Okay, so we got some solutions, but not everyone. So you have structured this problem in your mind in a certain way. And that structuring of the problem makes this just about impossible to solve. Now let's take a look at what happens when you restructure the problem. Now how many people can solve the number of the parking space? Everybody's hand should be up. All right, so now it's immediately evident, right? Now it's immediately evident that this has got to be 87. Because when you structured it in this way, 16, 06, 68, 88, 98, what could that car number be? It's going to be a very complicated mathematical algorithm. You're going to have to fit some sort of trinomial function to this or higher in order to get all those numbers to fit. Very, very difficult problem to solve it with this structuring of it. But if you restructure it, then it becomes immediately apparent. And it's not even, I wouldn't even really classify this as a problem or problem solving, because here it's immediately apparent. You got 86, you got 88. Clearly, the car has to be in parking spot number 87. So that's an example of cognitive restructuring. We also saw this when we were looking way back in the first meeting of this class, when we saw the problem about the 2 trains. One train is going 60 miles an hour, another train is going 40 miles an hour. They start 100 miles apart. A bird takes off from the first train and flies 80 miles an hour until it reaches the next train, immediately turns around, flies back to the first train, immediately turns around, flies off to the second train. And the question is, how many miles has the bird flown when the trains collide? And if you recall this one, you remember that if you represented this problem as a distance problem, that made the problem massively difficult to solve. And it would take you hours and hours, and actually it would take you calculus. In order to do this, you would have to set up differential equations as the trains got closer and closer and closer. Massively difficult if you represent it as a distance problem. If, on the other hand, you represent it as a time problem, then it becomes much, much more straightforward. So 60 miles an hour, 40 miles an hour, they're traveling towards each other at 100 miles an hour. They're 100 miles apart. They're going to collide in an hour. The bird's flying 80 miles an hour. So in an hour, it's going to fly 80 miles. It's going to travel 80 miles between the two. If you represent it as a time problem, it then is seconds before you can come up with the correct solution. So again, the idea is that when we're solving problems, one of the things that we do to attain that solution is to take our initial representation of that problem and then restructure it, change it somehow, flip it somehow, and then the problem becomes solvable. All right, so I'll give you another example of this. Another problem, this is called the monk on a hill. So I'll read it out for you. It says, at 9 a.m., a monk starts to climb a hill and spends the next 12 hours hiking to the top. He reaches the top at 9 p.m. and spends the night there in meditation. The next morning at 9 a.m., he starts to descend along the same path he used to climb the hill the day before. Taking his time, he reaches the bottom at 9 p.m. in the evening of the second day. So on the first day, starts at the bottom 9 a.m., reaches the top by 9 p.m. On the second day, starts at the top at 9 a.m., reaches the bottom at 9 p.m. And the question is, can the monk descend the hill so that he is not in the same spot at the same time on each day? So is there a way that the monk can descend the hill so that he will not be at the exact same spot on the path at the same time both of those days? So give that one a shot. I'll give you a couple minutes to think about this one. And we'll see how restructuring can help you solve this problem as well. All right, I think that was approximately 2 minutes. All right, so just a quick little show of hands. How many think that he can achieve this, that he can descend the hill so that he's not in the same spot at the same time on each day? So how many think that he could do that? There's a way to do it. All right, how many believe that he cannot do that there is no way to actually achieve this? I only got the one. And then everybody else, I guess, is undecided. Couldn't decide one way or another whether he could or whether he couldn't. Okay, so this, again, very difficult problem. And the reason is that often the way that we typically represent this is as two separate trips. And we start thinking to ourselves, you know, what if he runs up most of the hill on the first day? So on the first hill at 9 a.m., he just sprints up the hill. And then once he's about 90% of the way up the hill, then the monk is like, okay, I'm tired now. I'm just going to spend the next 11 and a half hours, you know, traversing these last, 100 feet. What if he does that? Runs up the hill, most of the hill the first day, and takes a lot of time for the remainder of the hill. And then what if he does the exact opposite? He runs down the hill, most of the hill on the second day, and then takes a lot of time for the remainder of the hill. And you might say, well, what if he runs up half the hill on the first day, and then takes a lot of time for the second half of the hill, and then runs down most of the hill on the second day, right? So what if he switches up his strategies on the first day and on the second day? Is there a way where he could achieve it, where he's not at the same point, at the same time on those two separate days? So this is what makes this a challenging problem, because representing this as two separate trips makes this problem very difficult. It makes applying the correct, what are known as operators, the correct moves, the correct strategies to this problem it makes it very difficult to solve if you think of it as what's his strategy on day 1 and then what's his strategy on day 2. If you separate it across 2 days, the way that the riddle is structured initially, it makes the problem very, very difficult. If, on the other hand, you represent it as 2 overlapping trips, if you take the 2 days and you overlap them into one 24-hour period, it makes applying the correct operators easy. It makes the solution very straightforward. So if this is the monk on day 1, 9 a.m., he's at the bottom of the hill. And this is the monk on day 2, 9 a.m., at the top of the hill. It's going to take him 12 hours to get to the top. It's going to take that other monk 12 hours to get to the bottom. Is there any way for this monk to get to the top of the hill and that monk to get to the bottom of the hill without being in the same spot at the same time? Well, when you superimpose the 2 trips, they're going to cross. They're going to cross paths eventually. And when they cross, they are going to be, wherever they are right here, it's going to be a certain position, and it's going to be the same time. And it doesn't matter what strategies they use. They might cross here at the bottom, they might cross in the middle, they might cross near the top. But at some point, when you overlap the 2 days, these 2 monks are going to cross. And when they do, same position, same time. And there is no way for them to get around that. There's no strategy where this monk cannot be in the same position on those 2 separate days. There's a hand. Yep.
Why don't you just walk down the other side of the hill?
It's the same path.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Any other questions about this?
So did you just add a monk?
No, it's the same monk, but it's on 2 different days. So this is day 1. That's day 2 up there. And then he's got to go from the top to the bottom on day 2. He's got to go from the bottom to the top on day 1. And there is no way, once you kind of superimpose the 2 paths, it's much easier to realize that there's no way that they can get from the top to the bottom and from the bottom to the top without crossing at some point. And then once you kind of overlap those 2 trips, it makes the solution much more straightforward, much, much easier. All right, so we're gonna end with restructuring, and we kind of showed you 3 kind of contrived examples of restructuring, 3 kind of hypothetical or educative examples of restructuring. Now I'm going to give you a real example of restructuring, and that has to do with cognitive psychology and conscious experience. So in cognitive psychology, we cannot yet address what is consciousness, where does it come from, how is it produced, or why do we even have it? So as computers become more and more complicated, we can see actual physical evidence that our cognitive abilities can be done without a conscious thinking, feeling entity. So one of the key questions in psychology, and for those of you that might solve it, you can thank me in your Nobel Prize speech, but one of the key things is, why do we even have conscious experiences? Why am I aware that I'm up here, right? I can do exactly what I'm doing right now without any awareness. So why am I aware that I'm up here? That brings to mind when I got my concussion. I can't remember anything that occurred between the time that I was approaching that turn and the time when I was sitting in my office. So I don't have a conscious recollection of that time period. I could have done that without being consciously aware. And also, when you take a look at the theories of psychology, none of those cognitive psychology theories require you to be aware. There's no sort of awareness mechanism in any of these. When you take a look at the semantic networks of knowledge, where is consciousness in that semantic network, right? If you take a look at the connectionist networks that we looked at, which connection is consciousness? And even if you could identify which connection is consciousness, so a lot of the work that's being done now in neuropsychology has to do with this question. What are the neurons that activate when we become conscious of a particular, experience? Even if you can identify those neurons, how do those neurons make you aware, right? We might be able to identify that they make us aware. We might be able to identify that this is the key, set of neurons in our brain. But what is it about those connections that make us conscious, right? What is it that forms this thing that we don't even know really what it is? And this is incredibly difficult because right now in cognitive psychology, we lack the concepts in order to answer this question. We lack the actual structure of thinking in order to answer this question. So right now, the way that we structure our knowledge of what cognition is the physical symbol system, right? If you remember that at the beginning, it's that idea that we have internal symbols that we can manipulate that are related to the world by interpretation and designation. We have that physical symbol system. We are exactly the same as an abacus. According to this physical symbol system, we're just a much more complicated abacus. And an abacus does not need consciousness to do what an abacus does. So where does consciousness come from us? And this is how we represent those problems. So this is something that is going to be solved eventually, I believe. And what's going to happen is somebody is going to restructure our thinking about what cognition is. And once they do that, all of a sudden, things are going to explode in terms of research on consciousness, because that obstacle, that not immediately obvious portion of the problem is going to get restructured, so then we know how to do things with consciousness. So historically, to give you another example of this, pre-Freud, pre-psychoanalytic thinking, human beings were convinced that we were able to access and we were aware of all of our thoughts. And there was a ton of really weird behavior that just could not be explained by us saying, we're aware of our thoughts. It's like, all right, well, why did I have this horrible dream? Well, we can't explain that because we're aware of all of our thoughts. Okay, well, why do I have this unhealthy fixation with this particular bad habit? Well, we don't know. You're aware of your thoughts. We can't explain that. They kept hitting that wall. They kept hitting that barrier between understanding, between that idea of we have access to all our thoughts, and on the other side of that barrier, we want to explain our behavior. So along came Freud, and he said, you know what? Maybe we don't have access to all of our thoughts. Maybe there's unconscious mental processes that we're not aware of. And he basically said, I'm going to take your structure that we are aware of everything, and I'm going to throw it out, and we're going to restructure the problem. We're aware of some things, we're not aware of other things, and then all of a sudden the understanding just exploded. Same thing is going to happen with consciousness. At some point, we're going to take this parking lot, and we're going to flip it over, and then all of a sudden we're going to be like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what we needed, and we're going to start making real headway in the study of consciousness. Yep.
Is it true that you only use 10% of your brain?
No. 10% of your brain is a massive, massive myth. And it's one of these myths that's like permeated, pop culture. And one of the reasons, there's a number of reasons for that. One of the reasons is if you take a look at scans of the brain, oftentimes a very small portion of your brain will be activated. So when people see that in news reports, they think to themselves, oh, that's all we need to do. We're just using that little portion of your brain. In reality, your entire brain is lit up. And what they do is they use a subtraction procedure where they have you not doing the task, they have you doing the task, and then they minus away all your brain activation. And then whatever's left over is what extra you do to do that task. So that's one of the reasons. Another reason is that they used to do studies on, it was a rather unethical study on mice, where they started destroying parts of the mice's brain. And as it turned out, you can destroy a vast area of the brain and the mice can still function. So again, the idea was that we only use like 90% of our brain. And it's one of those kind of pervasive kind of ideas, but definitely not at all, the case. So, and again, that's one of these things about restructuring, right? That's a nice example, because if you start off with that concept, we only use 10% of our brain. then you're going to start wanting to solve certain problems. Like how do we get psychic powers? How do we get telekinesis? Why can't we fly? Why can't we, do all these other things that we could do if we used 100% of our brain? How do we activate 100% of our brain? You would take a look at that barrier and you say, how do I get there? Once you realize, no, we're using like 100% of our brain, right? Just basic functions use a large percentage of your brain. Once you realize that, you restructure it, and not only you're never going to solve those problems, you realize they're not even goal states to be done. They're not even problems to even try to attain.
Like when I was little, someone told me that, and then I watched the movie Matilda. You know, she had a thing with her eyes. I was like, well, if I use like 50% of my brain, then I should be able to move things with my eyes.
Yeah.
That was my mindset.
And I mean, why wouldn't you believe that if that's where your cognitive structure is at the time? A recent, and that hasn't gone away. I mean, Matilda was like 90s, I think, or something like that.
Yeah.
A recent one. Has anybody seen Lucy? The Scarlett Johansson movie. Love that movie. That movie's great. The premise it's built on is utter nonsense psychologically. It's the idea that she has this drug ingested that now activates 100% of her brain, and she literally becomes like a god, like an omnipotent, omniscient being.
I really thought that if I could just find a way.
And yeah, no, exactly. And why wouldn't you if that is where you start? So we'll end on that. Not only does restructuring oftentimes help you solve problems, but also importantly, restructuring oftentimes identifies the goal states that you should be going for. So a lot of times when ideas are restructured, you realize that the questions you were asking at the beginning, they're the wrong questions, and you really need to ask other ones that are suggested by that. All right, so that is it for today. So remember the social media development. Please help your fellow students promote their work. And for the Wordies, we will take those up on Tuesday. If you want the experience that we're going to be looking at, do not Google those. Do not look at them. Put them away, and we'll see if we can solve them the second time we have a look at them. Other than that, we are done for the day.